Hi, I'm Jeremy Isao Speier. I am an interdisciplinary artist and filmmaker.
Through the glass, I see a darkening vortex. Displaced memories unfold. Through the glass, I see a darkening vortex. Displaced memories unfold. Spirits enter. I climbed the high summit to the altar. Upon the horizon, the sun rose serenely.
So what age do you think you kind of realized that you wanted to also be in art? Was it your whole life, or was it at a certain point?
I actually decided, more when I was traveling in Hawaii just after high school. But I was making art all the way through, elementary school and into high school. It was maybe a little more graphic. I did sort of more graphic type stuff, but I did paintings. And I actually did an animation film using my dad's camera when I was only 11 years old. Stop motion animation, which was I think it's about 12 minutes long. And it has various different animation that I made using his camera. So I think they're the more formative years of exploring more, whereas later when I decided to become an artist when I was 19 in Hawaii and came back to go to Emily Carr, that was a bit more of the bigger step to go a little more serious. But definitely prior to that, I was doing all that stuff when I was, still quite young. Also, want to mention that, places like the Western Front, in their very infancy, were places where they would go and hang out, and then there would be other friends and other people like Jeff Wall or Christos Dikiakos, or I could just go on a bunch of names. But so I was kind of around that kind of scene, although those were more my parents' friends, but I was always a young kid around that. And then also Video Inn would be another place where my dad would have been working out of too. So two very early Vancouver artist-run centers, kind of in their infancy, but that was when that sort of hippie movement coinciding with the art and all of that. So I kind of grew up around all that stuff, which probably did help shape me later, even though at the time I may not have consciously known it.
What year did you enter Emily Carr?
I entered Emily Carr in 1990, but I went to Capilano College for my first 2 years and finished with I finished with a very high grade point, being on the dean's list, which then some of my teachers from Capilano helped me to get advanced standing at Emily Carr, which is apparently they don't rarely do this. So I was able to go from Capilano to Emily Carr in 1990 to just do my third and fourth year to get my full diploma from Emily Carr. I was definitely very influenced some of my early teachers at Capilano to start. Barry Cogswell, who's no longer with us anymore, but he was head of the sculpture department. I feel like he put me under his wing, and because at that particular point I didn't even know if I was interested in sculpture, but he became one of my most important teachers. There was another teacher called Wayne Eastcott, a printmaker, and he now lives in Japan. All these teachers are retired now, but he lives in Japan and has a Japanese wife. He was trying to set up a residency there. I haven't followed up with him. There was another teacher in painting, Nancy Boyd, who's also a Capilano, and she was also a very good mentor, teaching me about more in the art of painting. But she would I learned a lot from her. And then as I went to Emily Carr, I would learn from artists like Carol Itter, and she was actually the partner of Al Neal, who I really liked Al Neal's work. And I had a kind of an infamous teacher, William Featherston. He was kind of a bit of a rebel teacher, and he was actually just about to I had him at the very end. He was almost retired. And he became also a very good mentor. He also seemed to make more hybrid work with painting elements that would have sculptural, like he would make paintings that would have sculptural elements, paintings that would have collage elements. Definitely in a different style than maybe some of the early collages, but definitely he was a big mentor because he saw that I was doing something different, and he didn't steer me away. If anything, he told me to go more into the different. He didn't steer me away and say go like this. He was open to what I already did, and he became quite a good mentor as well.
So it sounds like there was a lot of instructors during your schooling that influenced you.
Definitely, yeah. I'm not even remembering, I'm not naming them all for lack of time, but yeah, I think those are the more important ones.
And what about outside of school, just globally? Were there certain artists that...
Yeah, definitely, I grew up around this art scene, so I grew up around Jeff Wall's son, Sammy Wall, so I ended up working for Jeff Wall after Emily Carr. For not quite a full year, but we worked on his famous piece that's in the Tate Gallery now, A Sudden Gust of Wind, after Hokusai. And it was quite nice because it was one of the rare works that he was referencing a Japanese artist. And I actually have a couple of books on Hokusai. I always loved Hokusai, and so it was interesting that I became one of his Japanese Canadian assistants on this piece that was having this Japanese reference. And actually now that piece is in the Tate Gallery. It's probably one of his most famous pieces ever. And he was hard to work for. You had to wake up it was almost more like a film set job, working for the film industry. He'd come to your place at 6, 7 in the morning, and you probably wouldn't get home till similar 7 at night. And you'd work a full day, and he wouldn't necessarily pay you that well either. He would pay you not the highest, because you're just his assistant, but you would learn a lot about his process. He was mostly doing the staged photographs, so it wasn't exactly what I do. But because I do filmmaking, or that was just when I was beginning in filmmaking, then I could relate to it more than say if I hadn't, because the way he works is almost more like making, it's like a still photo, but there's a sense of it's almost like he's making a piece of a film, and then so there is that kind of sense of almost being on a film set because he has more people around, he has lots of assistants, he has people doing technical things. So definitely working with Jeff Wall was interesting, and I think that was an important, I guess, step along the way. But also my father played a big role in terms of, he had a PhD in sociology and anthropology from University of California, Berkeley. And so he was very knowledgeable. I never really went to get my master's degree almost because I felt like I could just ask him all these questions about different filmmaking. He knew a lot about film. He was a bit of an auteur himself. He knew a lot about foreign film. He knew a lot about art film. He knew a lot about experimental film. And so, yeah, I could run a lot of questions by him. He would always come to a lot of my shows, so I'd get feedback from him. Sometimes his feedback wasn't always easy to handle. Like, he wasn't always like, he could be sometimes a little critical.
That's how you develop them.
Right? He could be critical. In a way, you could say, he was more critical than not. But that was probably good, right? To learn critical distance, to learn the ability to, critical thinking. And then that's important when you make art that has ideas and concepts and themes. And especially because my work is very layered. There's a lot of layering in my work.
What's the ancestry of your parents?
Yeah, so my father was born in Brooklyn, and he was Romanian Jewish. And he grew up in Queens in kind of an apartment building that had a lot of immigrants. And actually, a good thing I wanted to add is his father was the manager of the Apollo Theater in New York, which at the time that he was there, it was a repertory theater. And so it showed a lot of foreign films. So he was able to go to see almost every foreign film for free. And my uncle as well, his brother, both of them are now passed away. But both of them got to see unlimited films. I think it affected my dad more than my uncle, because my uncle didn't become as interested in, although he knew a lot about film. But whereas for my dad, I think that was almost like film school for my dad. And so that kind of passed on through the generations, through my father and the Apollo Theater, and then him starting to make films when I was really young, I think did later influence me to make films.
We've talked about your dad.
Yeah.
So what's the ancestry of your mom?
Yeah. So my mother is now Japanese Canadian, but she was born in California, and my grandparents, her parents, were Japanese American. But they were born in America. But their grandparents were born in Japan. So I think that makes my mom third and I'm fourth. I think it's third generation. My mom is third generation, I'm fourth. But now that she lives in Canada, she's really, I guess, Japanese Canadian. And
where do you think she got her art influence?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my grandmother was also a very creative and craft-based person. She did a lot of quilting. One of her quilts hung in a show at the SF MoMA in San Francisco. But yeah, and she was also a volunteer at the SF MoMA. So she wasn't really an artist herself, but her sewing was amazing. And she would make us things, and she would make quilts, and I don't mean just really simple quilts. I mean quilts with really quite amazing patterns and colors and complex designs. And so I think some of that came from my grandmother, actually. And she had an interest in art too. She would go to SF MoMA and go look at, she would look at different various, whether it's, more contemporary, but she liked vary, whether it's more fine art or, so I think my mom did pick up some of that, and that's maybe what led her to later to become a potter.
There's a certain like attention to detail in the Japanese culture. Do you think you've picked up some of that in the art that you do?
Yeah, I do. I think that, especially when we look at my Made in Japan series, but even my Kinetic series, like if we get into the more kinetic artworks, we start to get lots more details and maybe a little bit more meticulously crafted as well. Whereas some of my earlier works are more bold and maybe a little bit more messy and more raw, a little bit rougher. But yeah, the details. But I think also that's a good point as well about the culture. But also, there's the detail, but there's also the idea of, Japanese are very like the aesthetic, this sort of the sparseness, like ma, negative space. The Japanese word ma meaning negative space. So they're very concerned about when they display even like things on a shrine, or, it doesn't even have to be in an art gallery. And yeah, so I think there is something in that as well, like the idea of the Japanese use of space, or the Japanese use of negative space, or the Japanese idea of minimalist, or, although they may not call it that, but you know what I mean, things that are very like simple and not busy, and right, sort of a more empty, a little bit of an empty canvas versus, a very busy canvas. Kinetics, I feel like they're more time-based and they're more experiential. And a lot of, like, if you look at the history of art tends to be more static, and so I like that I'm, again, breaking that boundary of static art and trying to bring it back to a more experiential and interactive. You could say it's not highly interactive, but it has more ability to engage you and to be interactive. And of course, elements like sound come in, sound, and then you could take a segue of sound and say sound art, but specifically, let's just for now talk about the kinetic and the sound. But yeah, like the sound field that it creates. Some pieces are quite quiet and are almost like inaudible. And some pieces can be more loud and have more rhythm, or can be maybe even be more noisy. And I feel like there should be a balance within that. It's not like all your pieces shouldn't be like, super loud, but then all your pieces shouldn't be so quiet. There should be some variation. I mean, this is the way I see it, but I feel like there should be some variation. That said, I can speak of people like Jean Tinguely, the famous kinetic artist, he made those sculptures that would explode. I don't know if you know what this artist, but he would make these sculptures, he did a whole bunch in front of in Paris, and like he's quite famous, and he'd make these giant sculptures with metal wheels, and they'd all like blow apart, things would fall off, and like that was part of it. You had to actually, there was probably a bit of a warning, if you could be hurt by this piece, because a piece of metal could come flying off, but that's definitely one. And I think maybe a little bit of that is good, I think it's okay to have a piece that maybe breaks a part of it. But then also having pieces that are more meditative is interesting. Those are the ones that might be quieter and maybe the motion is slower. Yeah, and then playing definitely with the speeds of the motors. Sometimes it's, a slower speed. Maybe it's like glacial speed. Maybe it's so slow it's creating suspense, you can hardly see it move. And other times can be more frenetic, or it can be more active and more intermittent, or yeah.
I noticed that some of your artwork has photographs in it.
Yeah.
So tell me about that.
Yeah, okay, that's perfect. I wanted to talk about the photograph. So the way I use the photograph is different than, the traditional photographer. Again, it's not I'm not using it. It's not so much about the decisive moment, or it's not so much about the technical skill or the technical moment. But the photographs become components in larger, broader, interdisciplinary installations. Or if you want to just talk about the piece itself, they become, collaged into the work, and so they become a component of a larger, more complex work. So the photograph isn't the end itself. The photograph is just another component.
I noticed some of the photograph. I think at least one artwork has your dad's photograph in it. So was that conscious choice, and what does that mean?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's also a good question. So, probably more often they're not autobiographical, but as I love to break rules and I don't like to I like to not always do the same thing. So yeah, I have a few pieces, for example, the ones you mentioned with my father as being a tribute, and just using the old photos of him, which do have the autobiographical element. And as well in the Kinetic series, I have one where I used a go-kart from an ex-girlfriend, and that was kind of, again, one of the few photos that I had a little bit of a attachment, whatever you want to call it, to, and I made the piece, again, similar to my father. It's more of a homage. And so, yeah, so when they're not autobiographical, they tend to be more found, and so they're, I guess, more universal, and they're not so specifically. But yeah, there can be times when I do use a photo that is autobiographical. And then, yeah, you're right, that changes the meaning a little bit.
How many films have you shot?
I have shot 3 experimentals, but I've also shot 3 documentaries. But yeah, the more experimental films. And I'm working on the 4th. But yeah. So yeah, so Oratory was my black and white film, shot in 16 millimeter. But essentially, it's an interpersonal drama about the god and goddess of wine that takes place in this kind of cave-like room, where he goes through various psychological states of mind, and there's a kind of a dark, lucid edge to it. And then Hero is one of the first films that I shot in high definition video, and in that film I loosely reference James Joyce's Stephen Hero, which was his first novel, as well as his novel that comes after, which is his more famous one, The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I take those 2 texts and make a fragmented narrative from the Joycean text. And using this art historical reference, I try to recreate a kind of a Joycean feel, but in my signature. So it's not just like it's not trying to just duplicate a period piece of James Joyce, but really just tries to layer Joyce into my already sort of my aesthetic or my style in filmmaking. That film is it's a short feature. It's about 74 minutes long. That one I also got funding from the National Film Board of Canada for. shot on location in Vancouver, but has kind of a faux Ireland feel to it. This hat is very dear to me because it was my father's hat, and he wore it mainly during that period that I speak of the emerging Vancouver art scene and all his forays into video and sculpture and activism. And I always remember this hat, and he didn't keep wearing it after. And then later when he passed away and I was given some stuff, I couldn't believe that he still had this hat and it was still in, because a lot of the stuff of his old stuff was in not very good shape, like it'd be really dusty, but this hat was almost, it looked like he had cleaned it, for all these years. So yeah, I was very fond. It was very dear to me to like get this hat. Also, I do like hats with brims, older style hats, and then yeah, it was so cool to get the hat he wore. And then actually one of the pieces in my Otto Telly's show, he's wearing the hat. So there's so many layers of personal meaning, and yeah, so anyway, great opportunity to wear the hat, and yeah, Dad, if you're watching up there, I'm sure you're happy about it.
And tell me about the artwork that's behind you.
Yes, I will. So this is another early work. The original title for this work is Chassis Driven Slip, Touched Universe Combined, but it has a couple other titles too. The simpler title was The Yellow Box, and then the third title was The Electric Lightbox. But essentially this piece is more of a freestanding floor sculpture, and it doesn't have kinetic elements, but it uses light and refraction. So it kind of came from an idea I had about looking at the city lights reflecting on the ocean and how the bands of color would reflect onto the ocean. So I decided to try to make a piece that kind of did that. So a lot of these taller shapes are more like the buildings. You can see it more on the other side too, and then this area is more like the water, and it's kind of like the reflections coming through. But then I added to it with this idea of this conical vortex, which is the cone. And then I also have these clouds behind it, and it's supposed to be rain, snow, and mist. And then behind here I have the demisphere, which has the red blood cell. You can look through this lens to see the red blood cell, and there's like a spiraling cage that goes within that. But each part of it's a piece that actually has a manual that goes with it, and each section has different components. And so like this part is called airplane. That part with the triangular forms is like windmill, sail, and ray. Down there you have the wheel. And then I named some of the other parts over there. And yeah, it completely comes apart into separate pieces, but can also be put together into one piece.
And what period in your art, what years was this developed?
Yeah. So this piece was built 89, 90.
Okay.
And this one did take like almost a year to make. Not quite a year, but maybe over six months to make this piece. Probably like about 8 months to make this piece. These larger pieces are early works, more assemblage based, but still feature some of the same forms as my other works. They're not turned on right now, but they have lights and motors and sculptural elements. But definitely this period is more influenced by the Black Mountain College artists like Rauschenberg, artists like Buckminster Fuller. But if we look at, they're definitely also informed by Russian Cubo-Futurism. Was one curator came by and told me that, and I liked it because he made it up, but I think it fits because definitely they're influenced by Russian constructivism. But Cubism, that's Cubo, and then Futurism was all about motion and speed, and again, was sort of like a Cubism, but it was more of an Italian movement. And yeah, they kind of fits into all of those three things. So that was definitely a good. But you could also relate it to the Black Mountain College artists, John Cage, Rauschenberg, fuller, and definitely using more found objects. And I guess, yeah, you could say this is some of my earliest versions of the found object art. Maybe, okay, the main difference maybe that I can note is they're a lot more painterly, and there's a lot more color, they're a lot more bold and wild, and they're also a lot larger. So they tend to have more, so there's maybe a little more of the Picasso.
Bit less of the Japanese.
Yeah, maybe. So they're a little, yeah, they definitely have more of the painterly and the color. Yeah, I'd say that's probably good. I think for me in art, and maybe that's partly because of how I grew up, art is more about crossing borders than creating borders. And I think that's what's changed now is people are more like interested in one, they kind of they stick to one direction. But I feel like in that period, there is a lot more of this idea of a lot of different things going on at once. Like when I mentioned Western Front, like there's, musicians hung out with painters and everyone kind of mixed together. And then I felt like that created more of that energy of like multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and just more of a common understanding of what other art forms are, which I think, personally, made the art better. And I think in some ways that's what I try to recreate, even though now we're not living in that time exactly, and there are some people like me that do this, But yeah, I feel like that border crossing is important to cross the medias, because a lot of artists stay in these kind of like, oh, I'm a painter, and then they just hang out with painters. And I think it's nice if you're more diverse, more dynamic, and having that ability. Well, you as a filmmaker, filmmaking is an art form in itself. And so, yes, I feel like that's an interesting thing that I would like, that I hope I can keep evolving, I guess would be the word, right? Keep evolving into this more multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary space where things help inform each other rather than separate each other,